As we take a look at this last section of Galatians chapter 2, we see that Paul is here in this very public conflict that he has with the Apostle Peter there at the church in Antioch. And he's going to bring this out here in the closing statement that he makes, quoting from this event that he had. Again, this is Galatians chapter 2, starting at verse 17, where we read, "But if while we seek to be justified by Christ, we ourselves are also found sinners, is Christ therefore a minister of sin? Certainly not. For if I build again those things which I destroyed, I make myself a transgressor." You see, Paul is anticipating a question in this debate that somebody would claim, well, listen, Paul, by preaching grace and that we're saved by grace through faith, you're going to make Christ a minister of sin. People are going to be associating with sinners and have a soft view of sin. And Paul's reply was brilliant. He says right there in verse 17, certainly not. He says, well, yes, we do seek to be justified by Christ and not by Jesus plus our own works. Second, and again, we're still right here in verse 17, we ourselves are also found sinners. That is, we acknowledge that we still sin even though we stand justified by Christ. But third, this certainly does not make Jesus the author or the approver of sin in our life. Jesus is not the minister of sin. And his answer is subtle but brilliant. In verse 18, he says, "For if I build again those things which I destroyed, I make myself a transgressor." If Paul were to build again a way to God through the keeping of the law of Moses, then he'd be making himself a lawbreaker, a transgressor. Essentially, Paul said this, there is more sin in trying to find acceptance before God by our law keeping than there is in sin in everyday life as a Christian. So now, in verses 19 and 20, Paul's going to talk about his permanently changed relationship to the law. Ready for this? He says this. Love these verses. "For I, through the law, died to the law that I might live to God. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me." You see, Paul's saying, listen, I died to the law. And I died to the law so that I could live to God. He was dealing with people there in the church at Antioch who wanted to force law back upon believers. And he says, no, I died to the law so that I could live to God. Now, he's anticipating a question. Somebody saying, listen, Paul, when did you die to the law? You look pretty alive to me. And Paul says, listen, I'll tell you when I died to the law. I have been crucified with Christ. It's as if Paul said this, I died to the law when Jesus died on the cross. He died in my place on the cross. So it was like it was me up there on the cross. He died and I died to the law when he died. Therefore he can say, and it's such a beautiful thing that he says right there in verse 20, "It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me." Since we died with Jesus Christ on the cross, we have a different life. Our old life lived under the law is dead, but now we're alive to Jesus Christ and Jesus is alive in us. Did you notice that phrase? But Christ lives in me. You see, Paul realized that on the cross, a great exchange occurred. We traded our life for the life of Jesus. So Paul's life wasn't his own anymore. It belonged to Jesus Christ. And he can give this great statement that he makes there in verse 20. "And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me." You see, now Paul lives and walks by faith. His relationship with God isn't primarily about keeping a list of rules, though there's obedience in the Christian life, but primarily it's a relationship of living by faith in the Son of God who loved us and gave himself for us. And this is so important that Paul concludes here in verse 21. "I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died in vain." Brothers and sisters, this is why it's so important for us. When we make the Christian life center upon keeping a list of rules, especially if it's a list of man-made rules, then brothers and sisters, it's as if Christ died in vain. What God went to the cross and gave us through the work of Jesus on the cross to do was to make relationship. Now, obedience flows out of that relationship. Paul wouldn't deny it. We certainly don't deny it. But our righteousness does not come through the law. It comes through a living relationship with Jesus Christ. Let me give you a really practical takeaway from this. Can you say with Paul, the life which I now live, I live by faith? Can you say that right along with Paul? And if you can, what does living by faith look like for you right now? Those are the questions we need to practically take away from this.